Today we are going to begin reading at the bottom of page 247. And when we left off yesterday, we had some good news. Of course, Esperanza had been very angry with Miguel a few days ago because we had discovered that he took her money that she had been saving to bring Abuelita to America. But what we've discovered in the last section that we read was that Miguel had used the money to go to Mexico and to get Abuelita safely out of Mexico, even though Tio Luis and his brother were watching the area and watching Abuelita and making sure that everything was just like they wanted it and that Abuelita wouldn't get to leave. But Miguel went in at night and he got her out of there, brought her back to California, or brought her to California for the first time. And so now everyone is reunited. And Esperanza brought out the blanket and told them that she had not quite finished it because she was waiting for that. And we can see that this blanket is a type of symbolism. Just like at the beginning of the story, Abuelita was sort of the leader of the women in the family. She took care of things. And now she's back in the picture in America at the end of the story to be the leader and take care of things again. But in the middle of all of that, while Abuelita was not in California, Esperanza had to step in and she had to mature and grow up a good bit so that she could take care of things. And the same thing sort of happened with that blanket. Abuelita started the blanket, Esperanza filled in the middle part, and then Abuelita is back to finish the blanket. And another thing that comes to mind here at the end of the story, because this will be the last section that we read, this is the final part of the story. We know that when Esperanza was in Mexico, she was just about to have her 13th birthday. They were preparing for that. She was waiting for the fruits to come in. She was waiting for presents and gifts to arrive. She couldn't even really understand the meaning of the word struggle or what it would be like to struggle and to work hard and that sort of thing. She was very spoiled. But now here it is 1 year later as she's turning 14, and now her hands are so calloused from picking fruits for other people that she can't even recognize her hands. Just like she can't even recognize her life. It's not even the same life as the one she used to have. But now she can understand the wisdom in the words of her elders, the things that they were telling her about mountains and valleys and hard times and easy times. So now we're picking up at the bottom of page 247. A few days before her birthday, Esperanza begged Miguel to drive her to the foothills before sunrise. There was something she wanted to do. She woke in the dark and tiptoed from the cabin. Page 248. They followed the dirt road that headed east and parked where they could go no farther. In the gray light, they could see a small footpath to a plateau. When they got to the top, Esperanza looked out over the valley. The cool, almost morning air filled her senses. Below, she could see the white roofs and the cabins in straight rows, the fields beginning to take form, and over the eastern mountains, a hopeful brightening. She bent over and touched the grass. It was cool but dry. She lay down on her stomach and patted the ground next to her. Miguel, did you know that if you lie on the ground and stay very still, you can feel the earth's heart beating? Do you remember that this is something that Papa told Esperanza? Miguel looked at her skeptically. She patted the ground again. Then he lay down as she was, facing her. Will this happen soon, Esperanza? Aguantante tatinto y la fruta caerá en tu mano. Wait a little while, and the fruit will fall into your hand. He smiled and nodded. They were still. She watched Miguel watching her, and then she felt it, beginning softly, a gentle thumping, repeating itself, then stronger. She heard it too. Shoomp, shoomp, shoomp. The earth's heartbeat, just like she had felt it that day with Papa. Miguel smiled, and she knew that he felt it too. The sun peeked over the rim of a distant ridge, bursting the dawn onto the waiting fields. She felt its warmth washing over her and turned on her back and faced the sky, staring into the clouds now tinged with pink and orange. As the sun rose, Esperanza began to feel as if she rose with it, floating again, like that day on the mountain when she first arrived in the valley. She closed her eyes, and this time she did not careen out of control. Instead, she glided above the earth, unafraid. She let herself be lifted into the sky, and she knew that she would not slip away. She knew that she would never lose Papa, or El Rancho de las Rosas, or Abuelita, or Mama, no matter what happened. It was Carmen, the egg woman, had said on the train. She had her family, a garden full of roses, her faith, and the memories of those who had gone before her. But now she had even more than that, and it carried her up, as on the wings of the phoenix. She soared with the anticipation of dreams she never knew she could have, of learning English, of supporting her family, of someday buying a tiny house. Miguel had been right about never giving up, and she had been right too about rising above those who held them down. So Esperanza is finally feeling that hope that has been gone for so long from her. She is finally feeling like there is opportunity and things will be better, and that she knows that Papa will always be with her and her old ranch will always be in her heart. And she feels more content and as though she can go off and conquer some of her dreams. In the middle of page 250, she hovered high above the valley, its basin surrounded by the mountains. She swooped over Papa's rose blooms, buoyed by rose hips that remembered all the beauty they had seen. She waved at Isabel and Abuelita walking barefoot in the vineyards, wearing grapevine wreaths in their hair. She saw Mama sitting on a blanket, a cacophony of color that covered an acre in zigzag rows. She saw Marta and her mother walking in an almond grove, holding hands. And then she flew over a river, a thrusting torrent that cut through the mountains. And there, in the middle of the wilderness, was a girl in a blue silk dress and a boy with his hair slicked down, eating mangoes on a stick, carved to look like exotic flowers, sitting on a grassy bank on the same side of the river. Esperanza reached for Miguel's hand and found it, and even though her mind was soaring to infinite possibilities, his touch held her heart to the earth. So in this year's time that has passed, Esperanza has gone from feeling like Miguel and she are separated by class to feeling like there is nothing between them now. In the middle of page 251, Estas son las mañanitas que cantaba el rey David. A las muchachas bonitas se las cantamos aquí. Despierta, mi bien, despierta. Mira que ya amaneció. Ya los pajaritos cantan. La luna ya se metió. These are the morning songs which King David used to sing to all the pretty girls. We sing them here to you. Awake, my beloved, awake. See, it is already dawn. The birds are already singing. The moon has already gone. And this is symbolism, too, of the hope that Esperanza is feeling with the sun rising here in the early, early morning hours. And as the light is shed across the land and waking things up, and it's like new beginnings and shining some light on new things to come. That's exactly how Esperanza is feeling at this time, that the light is beginning to now shine on her life and her future, and that things may actually turn out good after all. At the bottom of page 251, on the morning of her birthday, Esperanza heard the voices coming from outside her window. She could pick out Miguel's, Alfonso's, and Juan's. She sat up in bed and listened and smiled. Esperanza lifted the curtain Isabel came over to her bed and looked out with her, clutching her doll. They both blew kisses to the men who sang the birthday song. Then Esperanza waved them inside, not to open gifts, but because she could already smell coffee coming from the kitchen. They gathered for breakfast, Mama and Abuelita, Hortensia and Alfonso, Josefina and Juan, the babies and Isabel. Irene and Melina came too, with their family, and Miguel. It wasn't exactly like the birthdays of her past, but it would still be a celebration under the mulberry and chinaberry trees, with newborn rosebuds from Papa's garden. Although there were no papayas, there were cantaloupe, lime, and coconut salad, and machaca burritos, topped with lots of laughter and teasing. At the end of the meal, Josefina brought out flan de almendras, Esperanza's favorite, and they sang the birthday song to her again. Isabel sat next to Abuelita at the wooden table. They each held crochet hooks and a skein of yarn. Now watch, Isabel, 10 stitches up to the top of the mountain. Abuelita demonstrated, and Isabel carefully copied her movements. The needle rocked awkwardly at the end of her beginning rows, Isabel held up her work to show Esperanza. Mine is all crooked. Esperanza smiled and reached over and gently pulled the yarn, unraveling the even stitches. Then she looked into Isabel's trusting eyes and said, "Do not ever be afraid to start over." Now that is actually the end of our story, but the author, Pam Munoz Ryan, has included the author's note at the end of the story, and that's pretty interesting as well. So if you would like to stick around, I'm going to read the author's note to you now. I can still see my grandmother crocheting blankets in zigzag rows. She made one for each of her 7 children, many of her 23 grandchildren. I'm the eldest of the grandchildren, and for the great-grandchildren she lived to see. My grandmother, Esperanza Ortega, was the inspiration for this book. So we see in the author's note that the woman who actually wrote this book got her inspiration for the characters from her own family as she was growing up. She says, when I was a young girl, Grandma used to tell me what her life was like when she first came to the United States from Mexico. I had heard stories about the company farm camp where she lived and worked and the lifelong friends she made there. When she talked about those people and how they had helped her through desperate, trying times, she sometimes cried at the memories. It wasn't until I had children of my own that my grandmother told me about her life in Mexico, about a fairy tale existence with servants, wealth, and grandeur, which had preceded her life in the company farm camp. I wrote down some of her recollections from her childhood. How I wish I had written down more before she died, because I could never stop wondering about her transition from Mexico to California and what it must have been like. Eventually, I started to imagine a story based on the girl who might have been her. This fictional story parallels her life in some ways. She was born and raised in Aguascalientes, Mexico. Her father was Sixto Ortega and her mother, Ramona. They lived on El Rancho de la Trinidad, which I changed to El Rancho de las Rosas, and her uncles did hold prominent positions in the community. A series of circumstances, including her father's death, eventually forced my grandmother to immigrate to the United States to a company-owned farm labor camp in Arvin, California. Unlike Esperanza in the story, my grandmother had already married my grandfather, Jesus Munoz, when she immigrated to California. Like Miguel, he had been her father's mechanic. In the segregated Mexican camp with my grandfather, she lived much like the characters in the story. She washed her clothes in communal tubs, went to Jamaica's on Saturday nights, and cared for her first 3 daughters. That's where my mother, Esperanza Munoz, was born. During the early 1930s, there were many strikes in the California agricultural fields. Often, growers evicted the strikers from their labor camps, forcing many to live together in makeshift refugee camps, sometimes on farms on the outskirts of towns. The growers were powerful and could sometimes influence local governments. In Kern County, sheriffs arrested picketers for obstructing traffic, even though the roads were deserted. In Kings County, one Mexican man was arrested for speaking to a crowd in Spanish. Sometimes the strikes failed, especially in areas that were flooded with people from states like Oklahoma who were desperate for work at any wage. In other instances, the strong voices of many people changed some of the pitiful conditions. The Mexican repatriation was very real and an often overlooked part of our history. In March of 1929, the federal government passed the Deportation Act that gave counties the power to send great numbers of Mexicans back to Mexico. Government officials thought this would solve the unemployment associated with the Great Depression. It didn't. County officials in Los Angeles, California, organized deportation trains, and the Immigration Bureau made sweeps in the San Fernando Valley and Los Angeles, arresting anyone who looked Mexican, regardless of whether or not they were citizens or in the United States legally. Many of those sent to Mexico were native-born United States citizens and had never been to Mexico. The numbers of Mexicans deported during this so-called voluntary repatriation was greater than the Native American removals of the 19th century and greater than the Japanese American relocations during World War II. It was the largest involuntary migration in the United States up to that time. Between 1929 and 1935, at least 450,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans were sent back to Mexico. Some historians think the numbers were closer to 1 million. Even though, this is at the top of page 259, even though my grandmother lived in this country for over 50 years, I can still remember her breaking out in nervous perspiration and trembling as her passport was checked at the border when we returned to the United States from a shopping trip in Tijuana. She always carried the fear that she could be sent back on a whim, even though repatriation had long been over. My father, Don Bell, came to California during the Dust Bowl from the Midwest and, ironically, worked for the same company farm where my mother was born. By that time, my grandmother had moved her family to a small house in Bakersfield at 1030 P Street. Mom and Dad weren't destined to meet quite yet. Dad was 12 years old when he picked potatoes during World War II with the diaper crew. Those were children paid to pick the fields because of the great shortage of workers due to the war. He says the children weren't always the most diligent employees and admits he more often threw dirt clods at his friends than he picked potatoes. But can you imagine picking potatoes all day long in a field when you're 12 years old? At the bottom of page 259, it says later, when he was 16, he spent a summer working for the same farm, driving trucks back and forth from the fields and delivering workers. Much of our nation's produce comes from this one area in California. It is hot in the summer and cold in the winter. There are dust storms and tool fog, and some people do contract valley fever. Before I got married, I took the required blood test in San Diego, where I had lived during my college years. The doctor called because of an urgent finding on my lab results. I worried that something dramatic had been found until the doctor said, "You tested positive for valley fever." I let out a sigh of relief. I grew up seeing lugs of grapes on kitchen tables. I picked plums, peaches, apricots, nectarines, persimmons, almonds, walnuts, and pecans from backyard trees. Every year in August, I saw the grapes laid down on the ground to make raisins, the same way they've been made for generations. Lemons, tomatoes, or squash appeared on our doorstep from neighbors or my grandmother's gardens. I'd never been conscious of having any symptoms of valley fever. The only fever I recollected was my burning affection for my beginnings and belongings. Of course I tested positive, I said to the doctor. I grew up in the San Joaquin Valley. I knew that I had been naturally immunized to the actual disease by merely living there from the air that I had breathed growing up. My family's feelings for the company camp are deep-rooted and still filled with loyalty for their start in this country and for the jobs that they had at a time when so many had none. Most of the people I interviewed who lived in the same camp with my grandmother held no grudges against the Oklahomans or others who competed for their jobs at that time. One man I interviewed said, "We were all so poor. The Okies, the Filipinos, they were poor too. We all knew the feeling of wanting to work and feed our families." That was why it was so hard for so many of us to strike. When I asked about prejudice, I was told, sure, there was prejudice, horrible prejudice, but that's how things were then. Page 262. Many struggled just to put food on the table and sometimes seemed to be resigned to the social issues of the time. They focused only on survival and put their hopes and dreams into their children's and grandchildren's futures. That's what Grandma did. She survived. All of her children learned English, and so did she. Some of her children went to college. One became a professional athlete, and another a member of the United States Foreign Service. Others became secretaries, a writer, an accountant, and her grandchildren, newscasters, social workers, florists, teachers, film editors, lawyers, small business owners, and another writer, me. Our accomplishments were her accomplishments. She wished the best for all of us and rarely looked back on the difficulties of her own life. It is no wonder that in Spanish, Esperanza means hope.